Miniature painting is quite peculiar in the fact that none of us seem to really consider it art. For some reason, because we're then going to go and play a game where we make little pew pew sounds with our models, it doesn't really count. So this got me wondering, we do all of this painting on a 3D surface. How much of our skills can we now apply to a 2D surface and do some normal art? And it turns out we're not half bad. You definitely could use your miniature paints for this, but I decided to use some regular acrylics instead.
Oh, hold up. What's that?
Using a whole new paint range was going to come with its own set of challenges though. I mean, there is no Agrax, there is no Nuln Oil here. And we're also, on a flat surface where a wash isn't going to do anything. And so I painted some squares. The use of the first one was debatable, it's just a square, but the second one I practiced blending. Turns out we can use glazes, sort of like how we sometimes use washes, just to tint. But it wasn't long before I ran into my first problematic difference with this paint range. It doesn't cover anywhere near as well, the opacity just isn't there, particularly with the lighter colours, which to be honest is where you want the opacity the most.
Okay, I've more or less literally just drawn 3 squares. But for some reason this has given me sufficient confidence to actually start on something.
And I was actually going to go quite ambitious for my first painting since I dropped art in year 8. Nonetheless, I was going to do everything in my power to make this slightly easier for myself. I had a particular painting that I wanted to recreate in mind for the first thing that I properly paint. I wanted to paint this picture of Malenia from Elden Ring. This particular painting is actually in-game in the shaded castle, and this is what set me off on wanting to paint anything on paper at all. I wanted to give myself something to paint over, a sort of outline drawing of the painting that I was trying to copy. Now this time-lapse here is my last attempt. There were multiple, I'm not fantastic at drawing, and to be honest it was quite a difficult thing to copy. I did end up having to use a sort of quartered pattern to get it roughly to scale. All of my other attempts were either widely out of whack or sort of... well, no, they were all entirely out of whack. But I think it ended up turning out quite well. There is no doubt that one of the problems with the end product was that the scale is slightly off. Her torso is slightly out of proportion with her head. I also think that this particular painting has given me a few little leg ups, other than being an already existing painting, so I sort of already know what to do. There's no face. That's going to make it so much easier, because painting faces has got to be one of the hardest bits of painting, and I've had it confirmed from my proper artist friends. Yes, that is a hard bit, and we don't have any of that. And also we've got the slight advantage of, in reality, or reality with inverted commas, in the actual game, she herself is a bit out of proportion, and she's also really rotten. So anything that's a bit off is a little bit allowable.
Okay, I finally finished. This has actually taken so long that it's now a different day. You can always see in like the bottom corner of my shirt. It's a different shirt. Proves it's a different day. I think it's gone very well so far. Now I've just got to hope that the painting part doesn't ruin it.
Okay, so we're now actually on to the painting part, the bit that you've probably all come here to see anyway. And this is where the steepest learning curve set in, this first stage. And really all I'm doing here is creating a gradient from dark brown to a sort of light browny yellow, which I think retrospectively was by far the best thing to start with. Even aside from being in the background, learning the basis of gradients on this kind of thing where it's actually not a particularly important area was definitely a good move. The whole, do you paint the whole thing this base colour as you would in miniature painting versus maybe you don't because the paints aren't as opaque? I figured that bit out here. Well, kind of, but I still don't do it for quite a while for some reason.
The thing that I'm noticing is the hardest about this at the moment is colour matching. And, this isn't all paintings not going to have this problem because not everyone is trying to copy something. But so far, in terms of miniature painting techniques I'm trying to use here, all I'm really doing is stippling. There's a lot of stippling. There's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of building up, and there's a lot of stippling. We'll see how the rest that isn't just a brown gradient goes. I know that I should probably be trying to paint back to front, and so the first obvious choice for me was this hair, but this hair is almost exactly the same colour as this cloth here, so it would make sense to do them at more or less the same time. But the other thing is this is over this. So I think I should probably paint this underlying sort of cloth regular clothing first.
And so I got straight on with it. Here I'm still using that, leaving the brightest surfaces empty so the low opacity can still make them bright, but this is something I'm going to do less and less as this process goes on. Here I do think it worked quite well, but that was mainly because I was painting in the light colours and then slightly darkening them down over the top, so it wasn't enormously time efficient. The difference in opacity was quite useful for creating the sort of wrinkles in the fabric though, because I didn't really need to change colour much. I could just drag a light colour down in one streak and it would get darker as it went over darker areas.
Okay, we've got another section done. Next one we're going to do is the hair and the cape, the red bits. But just to talk about this for a moment, the whole technique for that area, which is completely miniature painting. At least for me, dark stuff, lighter stuff, and then lighter stuff. And then it was actually just highlighting. I mean, you know, all of these creases here, those are highlights. That's all it is. All you've got to apply it to is a two-dimensional surface, which is a bit more of a pain. I mean, it's the same. Miniature painting and flat painting, there's the same techniques, just... But now I say it, it sounds kind of obvious, but just flat.
The red was more or less the last section that I painted, the dark areas, and then the brighter areas and the brighter areas, because I was really running into problems with the opacity of the red, even in the darker sections. And I was just finding it really difficult to balance going exactly up to where I needed to. I'm sure if you're a more experienced painter, it would be a great thing to do, but for me I really just had to get down that solid, full area and then layer and highlight on top of that. And so as I moved immediately onto the hair, I did exactly that. Now, the hair was one of the trickiest parts actually. Because hair is so little and fibrous and that, it was quite difficult to balance both defining strands of hair to make it look hairy and also keeping that sense of depth. And so it's something that I came back to over and over again, and eventually resorted to using my very, very teeny tiny paintbrush to paint in lots of individual strands and then tint it to give the impression of depth. This was something I had to be quite careful with and build up slowly in a number of layers, but even then I came back to it over and over again during the project, to just trying to get to look like hair. I then moved straight on to painting the leather of the sort of straps and the belt, and that was, well, it was wholly unremarkable. I just didn't go quite as bright as I did on the clothing. When I moved onto the skin, I gave myself a bit of help. I let myself use Cadian flesh tone instead of having to mix a skin tone, which I thought might be quite difficult. Then, it was just a matter really of glazing in shadows and building up highlights again. But I did run into particular trouble with figuring out how much to darken each side of her neck. I'm not entirely sure why I found this so difficult, and I got sort of saved by being able to put weird sort of mottled rottiness on one side so you don't pay as much attention. But really it was the lips that gave me the most trouble. Very difficult to make those look normal.
The skin was not really as easy as I'd hoped it'd been. Well, actually, most of it came out alright. The mouth was the bane of my existence. It was really hard to get to look at all right. Still not entirely sure I'm happy with how it's ended up looking. Oh, if you're not familiar with Elden Ring, these weird little black bits over here are where she's rotting away.
This sort of fluffy hem to her robe was the bit that I was in advance the most concerned about. Making it look believably fluffy I thought was going to be a real challenge, but I also think it's one of the bits that turned out particularly well. I laid down the general shape of it blocked out in a sort of darkish mid-tone, added in shadows where I thought there should be shadows, and then built up in layers and layers of strokes with my tiniest brush, giving the look of individual strands.
So the final bit that I've got to do is the gold, and that's non-metallic metal, and I've only done non-metallic metal once before on this guy. Quite an old Warhammer model. I made a video about it. Go watch it.
And even though I had done non-metallic metal before, that was on a completely different kind of gold. This one looked very different. I started on all of the little dotted around small bits of gold on the model first, just so I could generally get the feel of what I was doing. I do come back to these later, but the first proper big section I work on is the darkest section of the sort of upper arm, which I think turned out to be a pretty good idea because it gave me somewhere to practice. It's the darkest section, so it's the bit your eye is going to be drawn to last, more or less. And since it turned out looking the worst, because I was just getting used to it, it doesn't matter as much. I do have the obvious advantage of copying an image, so I'm not actually really needing to think about where the highlights are going myself. But once you get down to it, the theory between this and painting on a miniature is more or less the same. It just takes a bit of tweaking in your own mind to get it to apply properly. I was using stippling here not just because I'd been using stippling everywhere else, but particularly because I wanted to give the impression of sort of beaten metal. I enjoyed painting these bits here the most, the little detailed sections. They were usually quite bright, and I think they just ended up looking particularly good. And now we are really left with only one proper section of the model left to paint. I really do think that the sort of shoulder section turned out by far the best. I'm still not entirely sure how I think the arm went, but I think overall it works quite well as a painting. It just doesn't quite carry across the look it has in the game. I really particularly like the slight orange warmth in the shadow of the shoulder. I wasn't properly conscious of doing that, but I'd fully recommend it to anyone else who's trying to paint non-metallic metal gold. Orange warmth is cool. And so now here we are, finally fully on the home straight. Let's see how this all turned out.